In the early 1960s, NASA embarked on an audacious quest to achieve what was once deemed an impossible dream, reaching the moon before the decade's end. At the center of these endeavors is the remarkable journey of engineer-pilot Neil Armstrong, who devoted years to rigorous training and risked his life in test flights, all in pursuit of an ambitious lunar landing. The movie opens with Neil Armstrong piloting an X-15 aircraft at the edge of space in 1961 when it inadvertently bounces off the atmosphere. Although he manages to land on the plane in the Mojave Desert due to his ability to think logically under pressure, his colleagues express concern that his recent record of mishaps is due to distraction. While at the hospital, Neil stands by his 2-year-old daughter Karen as she receives a then experimental radiotherapy treatment. Back home, he consoles Karen during the treatment's side effects, soothing her with a moon-themed song. Afterwards, he retreats to his home office to discuss with a specialist and review numerous medical papers and textbooks he's amassed, desperate to treat Karen of the brain tumor. During a friendly visit to the Armstrong residence, Joe Walker brings up NASA's search for engineer pilots for the Gemini program. Intrigued, Neil expresses interest but explains that he can't contemplate relocating to Houston due to Karen's illness. As Joe departs, Neil's wife Janet shows signs of stress, all while he keeps a watchful eye over the sleeping Karen. But Karen dies soon afterwards. As Karen's coffin is gently lowered into the ground, Janet stands tearfully beside their son Rick while Neil maintains a solemn expression. Following the funeral, Neil withdraws to his office during the reception at their home, surrounded by his assortment of medical books and documents. There, he finally grants himself the release of tears. He carefully places Karen's bracelet in a drawer of his desk. After bidding farewell to their guests, Neil and Janet find solace in a quiet moment together on the porch. The next day, Neil surprises Janet by informing her he's heading to work. Similarly, Joe is surprised when Neil eventually arrives, only to discover that he's been temporarily grounded pending an investigation into the X-15 atmosphere bounce. Grief-stricken and angry from being grounded, Neil applies for Project Gemini and is accepted to NASA Astronaut Group 2. With his wife and their son Rick, Neil moves to Houston alongside other astronauts' families. Neil befriends Elliot C., another civilian test pilot, and Ed White, his neighbor. In Houston, an astronaut briefing takes place under Deke Slayton's guidance, with assistance from Gus Grissom, and watched by Neil, Elliot C., Ed White, Pete Conrad, Jim Lovell, and others. Amidst the discussions, political considerations emerge. Deke impresses upon the astronauts the importance of the Gemini program, as the Soviet Union had reached every milestone in the space race ahead of the United States. Deke clarifies that the USA needs a coup in space the USSR can't possibly beat. At the training session, Neil is securely strapped into a rapidly spinning trainer machine, facing the daunting task of stabilizing it before the intensifying G-forces overwhelm him. As he begins to lose consciousness, Neil's vision transports him to a recollection of his past, filled with the cherished memories of a happy life with Karen and Janet. Upon regaining consciousness, Neil surprises Gus and Deke by insisting on another attempt. Later, as he struggles with the after effects and nausea in the bathroom, he shares a bonding moment with Ed, who is equally affected by the demanding training session. Upon Neil's arrival home, it becomes apparent that the Armstrongs have welcomed a new addition to their family, baby Mark. Later that evening, as they share a meal, the family enjoys their time together. On the White's back porch, Neil, Ed, and Elliot gather. Their conversation reveals that Neil is the backup crew for Gemini 5, and Ed is slated for a historic first EVA mission. However, a phone call from Deke interrupts their discussion, urging them to switch on the TV. The news on the television screen delivers a disheartening blow. The USSR has once again beaten the USA, dashing Ed White's dreams of being the first man to walk in space. The Americans decided to go ahead with their Gemini project to surpass their Russian counterparts. During the Gemini 5 launch preparations, Neil and Elliot, the backup crew, are introduced to the program's newcomers, Buzz Aldrin and Roger Chaffee. Their meeting takes an unexpected turn when Deke announces to Neil that he will command Gemini 8, partnered with Dave Scott as his pilot instead of Elliot. Just before the Gemini 8 launch, Neil carves out a moment to spend with his son Rick. However, their bonding time is abruptly interrupted by Ed, who bears devastating news. Elliot, who was piloting the plane, and another astronaut named Charlie tragically lost their lives during a flight for training in St. Louis. During Elliot's funeral reception, a surprising moment unfolds when Buzz openly critiques Elliot's piloting abilities. This comment sparks a heated disagreement between Buzz and Neil as Neil passionately steps in to defend his late friend's reputation. Seeking solace, Neil withdraws to the C's living room, where he briefly sees a vision of Karen playing beneath a table. He tells Janet that he must leave and subsequently takes their car. Ed and Pat kindly offer Janet a ride back home, and she confides in them that Neil seldom discusses Karen. Upon returning home, she finds Neil engrossed in taking sextant readings and decides to let him have solitude. On the launch day, Neil and Dave Scott receive assistance as they enter the capsule, with fellow astronaut Pete Conrad and several technicians lending a hand. The launch proceeds smoothly, and later, Neil successfully locates and rendezvous with the Agena vehicle. The docking process also goes off without a hitch, marking a significant achievement for the USA's spaceflight program. Meanwhile, Janet listens to the mission's progress in her living room, accompanied by her 2 sons, her mother, a NASA official, and a Life magazine photographer. However, tension rises as Neil detects the capsule's unexpected spin. Believing the issue originates from the Agena, Neil decides to undock, but the spin intensifies. Mission Control abruptly cuts off the public news feed, leaving Janet in a state of anxious uncertainty. Neil and Dave teeter on the brink of losing consciousness inside the Gemini capsule. In a moment of inspiration, Neil decides to use re-entry fuel to stabilize the craft. Climbing over the unconscious Dave, he activates the re-entry thrusters. The daring maneuver proves successful, halting their spin. However, using this crucial fuel forces them to abort the mission and prepare for an immediate landing at the earliest opportunity. Janet storms into Mission Control, her frustration palpable, and directly confronts Ed and Deke. She vehemently expresses her concerns, accusing them of losing control, asserting that their efforts seem akin to boys playing with balsa wood models, and threatening them to connect the newsfeed again. As Neil and Dave prepare for re-entry, they engage in a fruitless brainstorming session, desperately searching for an alternative method to stabilize the craft that would have allowed them to salvage the mission's objectives. The movie intercut between 2 scenes, the Gemini 8 pilot press conference, during which a NASA spokesperson attempts to highlight the mission's accomplishments, while Neil faces a barrage of questions from the press, and the formal mission review where Neil and Dave find themselves justifying their actions. First, the decision to undock prematurely from the Agena, and later, the choice to expend some of their re-entry fuel. In his home office, Ed visits Neil, extending an invitation for a beer at Dave's place. He finds Neil deeply engrossed in technical diagrams and schematics related to the Gemini/Agena mission. Neil, Ed, and Dave sit on the Scott's patio, sipping their beers. Ed expresses his support for Neil and Dave regarding the decisions made during the Gemini mission. However, in a candid moment, Ed confirms the authenticity of a rumor: he and Gus Grissom are slated to be part of the first Apollo mission. Deke's desire for Gus to be the first man on the moon also places Ed in contention for the prestigious opportunity to make the first lunar landing. Contrary to his apprehensions regarding the NASA investigation, Neil receives a complete pardon. His composed and skillful management of the Gemini 8 near crisis not only clears his name but also propels him into the Apollo program. However, it comes with an additional responsibility as he assumes a public relations role. The early years of the Apollo program unfold in a montage of scenes portraying family life in the Armstrong household. Strolling homeward alongside Neil, Ed White shares a heartfelt conversation about his son Eddie's deep fascination with the space program. As they stroll past a neighbor's swing set, it triggers a rush of fond memories for Neil. And he almost, but not quite, begins to talk to Ed about Karen. At the command station, Gus, Ed, and Chafee board the Apollo 1 command module for a dress rehearsal of their upcoming flight in 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Neil, dressed in a suit and tie at the White House, passionately defends the Apollo program's budget to a skeptical senator. Back at the test site, the countdown experienced a delay due to a communication issue. Inside the cockpit, the 3 astronauts wait, growing increasingly bored, until disaster abruptly strikes. A short circuit ignites, and a spark sets off a devastating fire. Within moments, the cockpit is consumed by flames. Simultaneously, at the White House, Neil is urgently summoned out of a reception to take a call from Deke. The wine glass he holds shatters as he receives the tragic news: Gus, Ed, and Chafee have tragically lost their lives in the cockpit fire. Later that night, Neil watches a pre-recorded CBS interview featuring Ed on his TV. The anchorman informs the audience that the first Apollo flight has been indefinitely postponed in the wake of the day's heartbreaking tragedy. Neil does not look ready to quit. At Ellington Air Force Base, Neil takes the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, LLTV, for a test flight, a lethal-looking contraption that proves impossible to control and crashes in a ball of flame. Neil manages to eject and use the parachutes to land safely to the ground in the nick of time. Deke and Bob Gilruth engage in a heated debate over the LLTV's safety, advocating for its discontinuation due to concerns about potential political repercussions following another accident. In response, Neil firmly asserts that political considerations aren't his primary concern. He argues that danger is best faced in simulation, not in mission. Neil arrives home bearing deep scratches on his face due to the LLTV accident. Janet, who is already perturbed by Pat's distress at the death of Ed, seeks an explanation for his injuries. However, Neil finds himself unable to provide answers to her inquiries or even stay in the same house with Janet and Rick. He hastily uses a pretext to retreat into his car and disappears. Since the failure of the Gemini 8 mission, protests have been happening around the town over the costs of the attempt to send a man to the moon, and it keeps intensifying. At the Kennedy Space Center, the fully assembled Saturn rocket emerges from the vehicle assembly building, drawing the attention of onlookers like Mike Collins, Neil, Buzz, Jim Lovell, and others. Neil watches the launch of Apollo 8, the inaugural mission to orbit the moon. Later in the bathroom, Deke informed him that Apollo 11 would be the first lunar landing and that Neil had been chosen as the mission's commander. Neil receives this news without an outward display of emotions. Deke reveals the crew assignments. Mike Collins will be the command module pilot and in the lander with Neil, Buzz. Deke offers Neil an opportunity to deviate from the planned crew rotation and replace Buzz with Jim Lovell, and Neil responds that he will think about it. With only a few days before the launch, Jane confronts Neil to discuss the mission's risk with their sons. She feels he's been neglecting to handle the human dimension of the situation and has dumped that responsibility on her. Later that evening, Neil and Janet gather with their sons. Neil answers simple questions, but when Rick inquires whether he believes he'll return, Neil wants to ignore it, but Rick persists until he reluctantly acknowledges the possibility that he may not return. As they part, Neil and Rick share a handshake. 3 days after launch, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit. Neil and Buzz undocked in the lunar module Eagle, preparing for their historic lunar landing. However, they encountered unexpectedly rugged terrain upon descent, compelling Neil to assume manual spacecraft control. With less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining, Neil skillfully piloted Eagle to a successful landing at an alternative site. After taking his first steps on the moon, Neil delivered his iconic line, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." As a personal gesture, he dropped Karen's bracelet into the Little West crater. Completing their mission, the astronauts returned home and underwent quarantine procedures. During their quarantine, they watched John F. Kennedy's 1962 speech, "We choose to go to the moon," on television. In a touching moment, Neil and Janet shared a tender connection. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you smash that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications to help the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.